Hi everyone, my name is Dean Holsworth. I'm a software engineer with CSIRO that works on APSIM. I'm also a part of the APSIM initiative that looks after APSIM. Today I want to talk about APSIM Next Generation and the differences between it and APSIM 7.10. So I'll start with a few slides here that describe some of those differences, but then I want to walk through the user interface and show some of those differences. So what was the rationale for creating APSIM Next Generation? Well, there are several issues with APSIM 7.10 that we wanted to fix. APSIM 7.10 has a very large source code base, probably in the millions of lines of code. That's very complex and very difficult to maintain. It's a framework that isn't fully cross-platform, so it doesn't run well or at all on Macintosh or Linux computers. And so we wanted to fix that. Ever since its inception, APSIM has been very slow and probably too slow for modern applications, like running at the continental global level. It's just too slow for that. Its documentation is quite out of date. Like all software applications, it is very difficult to keep the document up to date. Quite a few of the models in APSIM 7.10 lack validations, so we don't actually know how they perform against real world data, and that's something that we wanted to fix. And it has inadequate testing systems. It does some testing of the software, but we wanted to ramp that up when we created Next Gen. So in 2014 we created or started to work on APSIM Next Generation. And in 2018, this paper came out that describes some of these changes and some of the rationale behind APSIM Next Gen. The conceptual representation of a simulation in Next Gen isn't really that different from APSIM 7.10. There's still this concept of a field, used to be called paddock, I think, in APSIM 7.10. Typically, we call it a field or a zone in Next Gen. And a field can, like APSIM 7.10, have multiple crops. You can have some field management and water components, and you can have multiple fields. And typically, if you're modeling a whole farm, you have farm management sort of up at the top level. As I said before, cross-platform is important. So APSIM Next Gen, the user interface, as well as the models, they run natively in Windows, Linux, and Macintosh. So you don't need to run virtual machines when you're using a Macintosh while running APSIM. They will run natively. Runtime speed in Next Gen is a lot better. It's typically about 10 times quicker to run a single simulation. We can run a 100-year continuous wheat simulation in about 4 or 5 seconds in Next Gen. That would take 40 seconds in APSIM 7.10, so it's a lot quicker. In Next Gen, we use the plant modeling framework created by Brown et al., as described in that paper. This is a way for non-software developers to create models. And they do that not by writing source code, but visually in the user interface. So they can drag and drop and define the structure of a model in terms of its organs and its processes. And they can parameterize those processes all within the user interface, all without changing source code. Several of our models in Next Gen have been created using this technique quite successfully. In APSIM Next Gen, we are trying to auto-document or auto-create documentation from the validation and the simulations, which we'll look at in a minute, but also using a software technique called reflection that can go and pull out comments out of the source code and match that up with the input files. And so you can generate a PDF, something that looks a bit like this. We're trying to aim for a sort of a journal paper style of documentation in terms of look and feel. And a bit later in this talk, I'll walk you through one of these PDFs. In APSIM Next Gen, we've spent a lot of time improving the software process. GitHub is the central focus of this. So we have a single APSIM GitHub repository. A lot of developers sort of commit and push to that repository. Computer auto runs that, or compiles that build, and then runs the test suite, runs all the tests in the test suite. While that's happening, a software developer usually peer reviews that commit or that change to APSIM. And if it's a major change, we usually get one or more scientists or models to review that change. Now, if all of those three pass, we automatically create a new installation. We automatically create the changed documentation, and we push that out as an upgrade to users, which they can choose if they wish. To download Next Gen, it's done in the same way as APSIM 7.10. If you open up a web browser and go to www.apsim.info and click the download button, you say it's for non-commercial use, click non-commercial use, and there's a downloads link on that page, and a link to get to the APSIM registration system. So like APSIM 7.10, you need to register to download. Instead of APSIM 7.10 though, we want to download APSIM Next Generation. So you can choose your operating system here. In my case, it's Windows. You can then fill out the information and click yes, I agree. Okay, this is the user interface for APSIM Next Generation. On the home screen here, we can see a list of simulation files that I've opened recently. So it's a recently used list. We have some buttons across the top here to open an APSIM file or an example or some of the toolboxes. We can import an old APSIM file, which we'll do shortly. And we can also click upgrade to upgrade to a later version of APSIM Next Gen. So for now, I will open an example. This works very similarly to APSIM 7.10. There's a range of examples here. I will choose wheat, which is a continuous wheat simulation. And you can see that the structure of this is very similar to APSIM 7.10. We have a simulation tree on the left, and on the right-hand side, we have some configuration options. So very similar sorts of components are in this tree. There's a clock component that has the start and end date, the same as APSIM 7.10. We have a summary file, which is blank at the moment because I haven't run this simulation. I have a weather component, which shows you some charts of weather data, very similar to 7.10. We have a soil arbitrator component, which arbitrates water and N across fields and across different plant models. It doesn't have any configuration options, so I won't bother clicking on it. And APSIM Next Gen also has this concept of a field. It used to be called paddocks in 7.10, but they're either fields or often called zones in Next Gen. There's a report component where we can specify which output variables we want from APSIM. The difference here is that in Next Gen, you can get IntelliSense. So if we start typing something in the window here and we hit a dot, we can get a list of variables or properties, if you like, that relate to the model that's in that square brackets. So I put wheat in square brackets because that's the name of the model. I hit a dot, and then I can say, okay, I want to look at the above ground property. And if I then hit another dot, I can then choose what part of that above ground I want to look at. So I might want to look at above ground weight, which is in grams per meter squared. So that's the way you add variables to the report model. I'll just delete this one because we have that same variable listed further above. Fertilizer has no parameters to look at, so I won't click on it. The soil component works very similarly to APSIM 7.10, where there are layered variables. So the physical tab underneath soil has the bucket parameters like air, dry, lower limit, drained upper limit, etc. with a chart at the bottom. And the other components in here work roughly the same as 710 as well, like initial water, and you can specify your initial nitrates. Surface organic matter is the same. The starting residues. The wheat model doesn't have any parameters on the right. Microclimate is a mandatory model in APSIM Next Gen. It arbitrates light between multiple plants. Now, the one area where APSIM Next Gen is different are the manager components. So on the right-hand side here, you still have keyword value parameters under a parameters tab. So that part's the same as Next Gen, the same as APSIM 710. But the script tab shows that the language that we use here is a little bit different. So this is C#. We've adopted C# as our scripting language, which is the same language as in the Manager 2 component in APSIM 710. The difference is, though, that while the syntax is the same, the structure is a little bit different. So the event system is different, and the libraries that you call are different. So the language really isn't compatible with Manager 2, and it's certainly not compatible with the older Manager model in APSIM 710 because it's a completely different language. It's not even C#. But the concept's the same, parameters and with a script hidden behind it. APSIM Next Gen also has charts, the same as APSIM 710, but I won't click on that yet because I need to run this simulation. So if I go to the top of the simulation tree and click on Run APSIM, I need to save the file first because I haven't saved it. So I'll save it in my temp directory. Just call it temp will do. And this will run the simulation. So there is a progress bar down the bottom here, which you can't really see at the moment. Now the simulation is going to run a little bit slower than what it normally does because I'm using Microsoft Teams to record this tutorial, and for some reason that seems to slow down the running of APSIM. So normally 100-year wheat simulation would take about 5 seconds, not 14 seconds. So if I click on my chart down the bottom here, we can see there's a yield time series chart, which is similar to APSIM 710, but perhaps just a little bit cleaner in terms of its look. So I might just move that along. If I click on the series underneath the chart, we have the usual options of being able to change the X and Y variable, the type of chart, whether it has lines or markers and colors and things like that. Now, APSIM 710 has the concept of toolboxes, and NextGen has something very similar. In NextGen, you can split the screen and load a toolbox. So in this case here, because my screen's a bit small, it's under this drop down, I can look at the management toolbox, and that will show in the right-hand side here. So at the moment in NextGen, the list of management scripts is a bit limited. This is growing all the time. But you can add these to your simulation through either drag and drop or right-click, copy, and paste it over onto the left. Another way to do this is to find an example simulation that has a manager script that you want, and you can copy it from there as well. So if I close this split screen down, I can go and open up another file. So the home tab here allows me to, it takes me back to the home screen, which then allows me to open another example. So if I open a different one, in this case maize, you can see that it's added another tab up to the top here. And so I could then go and copy bits out of this example and paste it into my original temp example. So I'll close that simulation down, that simulation file. The other thing I want to show you is on the home screen, we have the ability to import an old APSIM file. So I'll do that now. Click import. Now I have an old APSIM 710 set of simulations here. This is the 710 release. I'll choose, where is it? Continuous wheat. Say open, and it converts the file format. The file format is quite different in APSIM Next Gen. So you can see here it's imported the 710 weather and clock components correctly. It's put in a summary file and a paddock. It's also converted the soil old format into the new format. So that all works correctly. The thing that's different though are these manager scripts, as I mentioned before. It really doesn't understand, well, it really is not able to convert an old manager script to a next gen script. So what it does is it brings the script in, but it comments it out. So this is, to get this script to run would require some manual editing of the script to bring it up to next gen format. But in the case of something like fertilize at sowing, it's actually quicker to go and grab a fertilize at sowing manager script out of the management toolbox and just drop that in rather than trying to convert this script. So I'll close that down. Do I want to save that? No, I don't. So I'm back here to my temp script. I thought I might show you how the experiment or factorial system works in NextGen. So currently we have a single simulation called, funny enough, simulation, but you can add a factorial node to this to build a, let's say, an N-rate trial. So if I right click on the top level node called simulations and go add model, that brings up a list of things that I can add to a simulations node. This is another way to get at various components in NextGen. You can get them from a toolbox, but I actually prefer to right click and say add model to bring up this list. It just is quicker. So underneath factorial, we have an experiment. So I'm going to double click that, and that adds it to the bottom of your simulation tree. So I'll use Control up arrow to put that up the top. There we go. Now the way the experiments work in NextGen is that they need a base simulation to be a child of that experiment. So that this simulation here needs to go underneath experiments and not a sibling of experiment, but a child. So I can drag and drop that, put that on, so I can right click on that and go copy and paste that on experiment. So now it's a child. I'll delete that one there. So now I have a child node called simulation. It can be called anything at all. Now to define the factors for this particular experiment, I once again right click and go add model. Underneath factorial, I want to add a factors node. So double click that. I might control up arrow that so that it's where I prefer it to be, directly underneath experiment. And then underneath here, I can do the same thing again, right click, add model, and choose a factor. This is where you can define the factor levels or the factor values or treatment values, if you like, for this experiment. So double click that. Now there are various options to specify these treatment values. What I'm going to do, because I'm going to set up an N-rate experiment, I want to modify the amount that gets put on through this sowing fertilizer script. So I will type sowing fertilizer there and press a dot, which brings up the IntelliSense. So the IntelliSense works in lots of different places in NextGen. Now manager scripts all have a script child, which is where all the interesting things are. So when you're doing this, always choose script. and then press dot again, which will give you the variables that you defined in that script that you want to change. So I want to set the amount of fertilizer that gets applied. So I'll double click that, and then I can say, okay, I could give a whole bunch of numbers separated by commas right here to get different N rates, or I can do as per this example up here and say 0 to 200 in steps of 20. So it'll give me a range of N rates from 0 to 200 in increments of 20. So if I click on the top level experiment node, you can see now that it is telling me that there are 11 simulations that it is going to run. Now the names are quite long, because what it does is it uses the experiment node and factor node, and then puts on the factor value in case in this case N rate. So I'm actually going to name that to just N. I'm going to call this XPT just to shorten it for now. So now my simulation names are much shorter, and they'll graph a lot better when they're like this. So I better go and run this. So right click and go run APSIM. This will run all 11 simulations. Once again, these simulations are running much more slowly than they would normally, but that's okay. Let's go and have a look at our chart. Now at the moment, this is still plotting the yields for this particular simulation, because the chart's underneath the simulation and is scoped by that simulation. We want to plot the yields for the entire experiment. So I will copy that chart and paste that onto the experiment node, and just minimize that to make it a bit cleaner. So now it's picked up all of the yields for all N rates, but it's done that as a single series. So what we want to do is separate each of those N rates, or vary, in next gen terms, vary something by N rate. So I can say I want to vary the color by clicking on color. I want to vary by N. So click on that, and now it's separated that one series into all 11 series. So I will just get rid of the marker type, make that none, and click up the top. So we've got our different N rates by date. If we want to change the title, we can do so over in the tree. So we're going to call this yield by N rate. So that's a time series plot, which is not particularly useful, but what we can do is come back down to the series and change the type from a scatter plot to a box plot, and change the X variable to simulation name. I click back up here. It's hard to read because there's lack of screen real estate, but you get the idea. So what it's done is it's created a box plot for each of the N rates, and you can see why I wanted to shorten those simulation names across the bottom here. Now the X-axis title is not really date anymore, so if we double click that, we can just change that or leave it blank. If you leave it blank, APSIM Next Gen will try and choose a title automatically, or you can type in your own. Let's just call this N rate. And that's our N rate chart. Just click away. Now we could also go and create a probability distribution chart as another option. So all outputs from APSIM are written to this thing called a data store. So we can see what tables are in this data store currently. There's only one at the moment, it's called report. And we can see all the data for all the different simulations, all written in one place. So in APSIM 7.10, they're all written to separate .out files. In NextGen, they're all written to a data store and saved in an SQLite.db file behind the scenes. You can right-click on this data store and add various post-simulation tools. Once again, through Add Model, in the Post-Simulation Tools folder, we can see there's a probability component, which we double-click, so we add that. So we want to tell it to summarize the report table. We want a probability of exceedance, and I'm quite happy for it to split on simulation name, so we get a different probability distribution for each simulation name. I just need to rerun that. So I'll right click and go run APSIM again. Okay, let's finish running. Now I'm going to take a copy of this chart to create a probability chart. So copy that, paste that on the experiment node. Oops. The other thing APSIM Next Gen has is an undo feature. I just accidentally deleted the experiment, so I'll click undo. Okay, so it's back. Now I can paste my chart, call this yield probability. Now, instead of plotting data from the report table, I will plot from the probability table. My X variable will be yield. My Y variable will be probability. And I don't want a box plot. I want a just simple scatter plot. And I will still vary the color by N rate. So I get that. And I might move this legend. So double click the legend and put that on the top right hand side. Okay, this is not right. The X title I might change. I will just clear the title, so APSIM Next Gen will generate a title, which is fine for now. And this one here, I'll do the same thing and just get rid of that. Click away. Okay, so we end up with a yield probability distribution as an alternative to our box plot. Now, before I leave this user interface tutorial, one other thing I want to point out is the versioning of APSIM Next Gen. It's quite different to APSIM 7.10. The version number consists of year, month, day, all separated by dots, and there's a GitHub issue number on the end. So you can look up that issue number on GitHub if you like, but generally, if you look at the year, month, day, that part of the numbers will go up, through time. So you can always tell from the version number, how old the version that you're using is. To get more information about APSIM Next Generation, you can click the APSIM Next Gen link on the apsim.info website, or you can click the help button in APSIM Next Generation. So there is some general documentation here about development and how to contribute, and also some tutorials on various use cases. But probably the main page to look at is the model documentation. This gives you an up-to-date list of all models that are in APSIM Next Generation. So if you're not sure what's included, this is the page to go to. It lists the models that are currently in release, and also the models that are under review by the APSIM Initiative Reference Panel. The other thing that this page does is give you links to the auto-generated documentation and also any sort of handwritten science documentation to get more information about it. So in this case here, we will go down and have a look at the wheat auto documentation. So if you click the PDF link, so this is our generated wheat model documentation as a PDF. It's open inside my browser. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the structure of the PDF. We just collapse that. You can see that there's some general APSIM description, but there's a description of the wheat model, a validation, and a references section. So if we look at the model description, we can see that it's quite detailed. So there is a section here for each of the major components of wheat in terms of each of the organs and phenology and the structure class. And in phenology, we can see there's a description of how the phenology model works, complete with some references, which link to the references section. And then each of the processes within phenology are also described. So we can see how thermal time is calculated. We can see the phases that the wheat model, the phenological phases that the wheat model uses. And each of those phases is then described in some detail. So there's a lot of detail in these documents. The other thing these documents contain is a validation section. The combined results section contains the overall validation of the wheat model. If we just make this a bit narrower. The model developer has set up these graphs, and these are from the wheat validation file. So we have predicted observed yields and biomasses, leaf area indexes, and grain numbers for all the different treatments of all the different experiments with an overall validation stats for each. So this is kept up to date. So if you want to see what the current validation for the wheat model looks like, it's a matter of coming to this document, which is always up to date. The other thing these documents have, as well as overall results, you can then drill down into individual experiments. So we can see here the Southeast Queensland results, along with Western Australia and the other locations. For further information, there's also a references section. This lists the papers that the wheat validation developer has included, and these are links straight through to the actual papers. So that concludes this tutorial on APSIM Next Generation and the differences between it and APSIM 710. Many modelers are already using APSIM Next Generation in their project work, and the APSIM software team is spending all of its time on APSIM Next Generation. So essentially, APSIM 710 has been deprecated. For that reason, we recommend that you use APSIM Next Generation in your project work if the modules that you require are available in APSIM Next Generation.